Hello, and welcome to our panel on the geopolitical reverberations of the Iraq War and repercussions in the MENA region. My name is Ahmed Musa from the Columbia Global Centers in Amman, and I thank you for joining us today. This discussion is the second in a series of 4 panels scheduled throughout this year on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. This series focuses on the lasting impact of the war on both the humanitarian and geopolitical landscape. For those who have missed the first conversation in the series, we delved into the consequences of the Iraq invasion on the fundamental humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. We also examined how the framing of humanitarian action adopted by the United States in 2001 has caused the blurring of boundaries between civilian and military operations, ultimately affecting the provision of humanitarian aid. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by renowned experts who will assist us in analyzing the geopolitical consequences of the Iraq War. Our panelists will shed light on the deepening challenges that the Iraqi state is currently struggling to address. They will deepen our understanding of the transformed regional order that has emerged since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They will consider noteworthy post-war developments, the changing strategic alliances in the MENA region, and the revised arrangements within the regional security framework, all of which directly impact the internal political dynamics of Iraq. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our panelists and our moderator. And before I turn the floor to them, I would like to say a few words of introduction. We have with us today Dr. Dina Asfandiari, Senior Advisor in the Middle East and North Africa Department of the International Crisis Group. Previously, Dina was a fellow in the Middle East Department of the Century Foundation and a research fellow in the International Security Program at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Dina also worked at the Center for Science and Security Studies in the War Studies Department at King's College London and at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Dina has published widely and is the co-author of Triple Axis, Iran's Relations with Russia and China, and Living on the Edge, Iran and the Practice of Nuclear Hedging. Thank you, Dina, for joining us today. We also have with us Dr. Shamiran Mako, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, with a joint appointment at the university's Political Science Department. In 2022, Shamiran was awarded a Fulbright U.S. Scholars Fellowship as Canada Research Chair in Global Governance. The primary areas of her academic work and instruction revolve around the study of international relations and comparative politics in the Middle East. Her particular interests lie in ethnic politics, the functioning of institutions and power-sharing arrangements, post-conflict state building, and the governance of societies characterized by divisions. Shamiran has co-authored After the Arab Uprisings, Progress and Stagnation in the Middle East and North Africa, and co-edited State and Society in Iraq, Citizenship under Occupation, Dictatorship, and Democratization. Thank you, Shamiran, for joining us today. Also with us is Dr. Renad Mansour, Senior Research Fellow and Project Director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. His research explores the political economy of state building, conflict, and development in Iraq. Renad is also a Senior Research Fellow at the American University of Iraq and a Research Fellow at the Cambridge Security Initiative based at Cambridge University. He was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he taught on the international relations of the Middle East. Renad is the co-author of Once Upon a Time in Iraq, published by BBC Books Penguin Publishing House to accompany the BAFTA-winning BBC series. Hello, Renad. Thanks for joining us. And our moderator for today is Dr. Azmat Khan, the Patti Cadby Bursch Assistant Professor of Columbia Journalism School, where she directs the Simon & June Lee Center for Global Journalism. Azmat is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the New York Times, whose work has grappled with the human costs of war. Her multi-part series in the New York Times, The Civilian Casualties Files, was based on more than 5 years of investigative work, including extensive on-site inquiries at over 100 incidents of civilian casualties in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. This in-depth project involved analyzing over 1,300 previously classified military records and documents obtained through a legal dispute with the Pentagon, as well as conducting numerous interviews with military personnel and local sources. Her investigations for the New York Times, the PBS series Frontline, and BuzzFeed's investigations team have prompted widespread policy impact from Washington to Kabul and won more than a dozen awards, including the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, Overseas Press Club Awards, the Polk Award, and the Hillman Prize. Azmat serves on the board of directors of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. Thank you, Azmat, for being with us. Lastly, I would like to introduce Minette Zard, the director of the program Forced Migration and Health and associate professor of population and family health at Columbia University. Minette is responsible for spearheading and leading the series of panel discussions, and she's an expert on global governance and accountability related to forced migration with experience in policy advocacy and philanthropy. Previously, Minette served at the Ford Foundation in New York, the International Council on Human Rights Policy in Geneva, and the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. She has worked with the Brookings Institution, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and held positions at the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights First in New York. Before I turn over to Minette, who will say a few words to mark World Refugee Day, thank you for being with us today, and we invite you to please tune in for the remaining 2 seminars that we're planning to hold in the fall, and these seminars will explore funding constraints on humanitarian organizations impacting aid to civilian populations and the impact of shifting technologies on the nature of war. Thank you, and over to you, Minette.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, and a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the program on forced migration and health here at Columbia University. And I think it is fitting that the second panel in our Iraq seminar series should be taking place on the occasion of World Refugee Day, a day where we mark the somber milestone of over 100 million people displaced worldwide, both internally, within borders, and also across borders because of conflict and persecution. And this milestone, I think, is made even more poignant by the human tragedy that we've seen unfolding off the Greek coast last week, and the apparent callousness shown by states in the face of the hundreds of refugee and migrant lives that were lost in that tragedy, many of them from regions affected by the post-9/11 wars of the United States. And indeed, the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the US unleashed a series of repercussions across the region and the globe, including multiple cycles of exile, displacement, and return, which we're still very much in the throes of. It's estimated that the war displaced approximately 1 in 25 Iraqis from their homes, according to a Brown University study. And of course, fighting connected with the Islamic State, especially after 2014, really compounded and added to this displacement. Today, Iraq still grapples with an IDP population of over 1 million and the challenges of managing over 5 million refugees and IDPs who have returned. And the political context in the region remains as volatile as ever, with the prospect of new conflict and new cycles of displacement ever present. So our panel today will really help us unpack and better understand some of these geopolitical reverberations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Azmat to lead us in today's discussion. Thank you, Azmat.
Well, thank you both, Ahmed and Monette. One small correction, I am not a doctor, I'm just a journalist, but it is a pleasure to be here with 3 others with PhDs and experts in this region who've just done extraordinary work. And there was a previous conversation that the center has done and organized related to internally within Iraq, what some of the changes were related to this war while it was taking place. But today's conversation is really an opportunity to look at this broader historical and geopolitical context, to understand some of these larger reverberations that have happened in the region, but also have affected Iraqi politics, governance, civil society. So we'll have a chance to talk about all of these things, but Dina, I want to start with you. Can you provide some historical and geopolitical context for the evolving regional order in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq in 2003?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And thank you so much to everybody for having us for this panel. I think we've seen the region go through various phases over the course of the last 3 decades. I think immediately after the invasion of Iraq, the rise of Iran and the empowerment of its proxies was kind of the first headline kind of trend that we saw in the region. Many in the region had felt that Iran had basically won as a result of that invasion, and that's because one of Iran's main regional rivals was essentially taken off the map. So it's kind of inevitable that this was going to be their view of what had happened. It made many nervous in the region, including the Gulf Arabs, because they felt as though a buffer had been removed between themselves and Iran. And it also changed the regional balance of power as people saw Iraq go from what they perceived to be the Sunni sphere of influence into the Shia sphere of influence. And so this created a new tense environment where the region was largely bipolar characterized by a rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now that Iraq, the third pole, had been taken off the map, it was now firmly Saudi Arabia and Iran that were competing against each other, and the region was the playground in which this competition occurred. That, I think, lasted more or less until the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011, which was this wave of unrest that had caught many people off guard. And that basically led to an era where we saw the rise of new decision-making centers in the region. So basically, the region previously, characterized by this Iran-Saudi rivalry, is slowly now turning into, in this post-Arab Spring era, turning into this like multipolar region where there are new decision-making powers in the region because countries in the region are more assertive, they're more independent in the pursuit of their foreign policy, they're more willing to pursue their interests, even if these don't coincide with their long-standing partners, usually the US. And so that is kind of leading us to this period of this new period of instability where you have multiple power centers in the region. And all of that is happening as the region perceives the US to be pivoting away from the Middle East region. It doesn't matter if this isn't actually happening on the ground, or if it is, but less than what the US had originally anticipated. The region heard the US when the US basically turned around and said, look, we're not interested. We don't want to be bogged down in the Middle East. We've dealt with the conflicts that we were involved in now, and now we want to expand our horizons, look towards Asia. And because that was so predominant in US official rhetoric, the region heard them, and now it's firmly how it's seen in the region, which means that people are, still want the US as a partner, particularly a security guarantor in the region, but at the same time, they don't trust Washington to be there and to have their backs if things get complicated or difficult. I think that's how I would characterize the shifts that we've seen in the region.
No, that was a great introduction to a lot of these issues, and we're going to unpack more of them. So thank you so much. Renat, I actually want to come to you to kind of seize upon something that Dina was speaking about, which was the shift or the perception of a shift of the sphere of influence of Iraq from a Sunni sphere of influence to one that was a Shia. Can you just describe how that took effect, starting with the war itself, but also in the years afterward and the change in the US role in terms of that as well?
Sure, and it's great to be on with you all. Thanks for the invitation. I think there's largely this sense that the Shia and the Kurds in particular were persecuted under the Saddam Hussein Ba'athist regime, and they were driving the opposition to Saddam. And so in 2003, when the US invade and occupy, these are the state builders. So those who build the state are primarily identity-based Shia groups and Kurdish groups with a little bit of Sunni accommodation. And identity becomes important to them because a lot of these leaders are coming to Baghdad for the first time after decades away. how are they going to represent people from Basra, in these localities all over the South Center? They haven't been there for a long time. And to do that, they focus on Shiism because that's a glue that could connect them. And in focusing on Shiism, they're able to develop this ideological capital, even relying on clerics. And in 2005, Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani basically endorses this system which is outright Shiism. And under this idea that the majority could never become a minority again, and this becomes a common sort of expression. And the Saddam Hussein regime, the previous regime, is largely then considered to be a Sunni and sort of, Sunni, although of course many Sunnis were persecuted under Saddam's regime in any case. And what you have is a process of debassification, which is used to target Sunnis, and Iraq effectively, therefore, becomes a government that's based on ethno-sectarianism as its driving force. In Iraqis call it muhassasa. And in which, this sense of oppression in Shiism becomes a powerful tool to win elections. And we see how high the voter turnout is in 2005 based on this new face of the state.
And as you've seen, I just want to unpack this a little bit more with respect to the US role too, which was, it seemed for years that there were attempts. It was very clearly the United States that was involved in that decision, not that decision to de-Ba'athify some of the things that you're describing, but it also seemed that they were starting to become aware that this imbalance, especially when it came to contracting, jobs, who these jobs were going to, the people that they were winding up working with were often those who'd been oppressed under the Saddam regime, that was having this sort of cyclical effect of violence. And there were attempted efforts with the president at the time to try to transform that, to try to rein in some of what, for example, Nouri al-Maliki was doing with respect to that balance. At what point did that shift? At what point did the United States try to extract itself from the situation, no longer play that arbiter role?
Yeah, it's a good question because, and I think it's right to sort of blame both the Iraqi exiles who come in, but also the Americans who facilitated. Paul Bremer is basically the sovereign of Iraq. And in two decisions, he removed, his CPA order, the first one, he removes 40,000 senior civil servants from the government. These are the people who know how things function. Not everyone was in this inner circle of the Saddam Hussein regime. So it goes from regime change to destroying a state, partly. And the Americans keep in mind, have been working with these leaders for almost a decade in the opposition. They've had conferences in London and New York and other parts. And this plan has been slowly being developed through these years, right? So you have this idea of how ethno-sectarianism needs to be the tool. And keep in mind that the UN and everyone, they believe in this, right? Because we need to, if Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds, he repressed violently Shia. So the solution is Iraq is this country that is a sort of artificial country that's been made up. And the only way to ensure that we don't have those kind of genocidal campaigns is to ensure there's representation in a very sort of neoliberal quota-based way across. So there's that. The violence primarily comes beyond the kind of decision of the US to basically remove the army and all this. The violence actually comes in large parts to those who were excluded from this new political settlement, right? So the big sort of elephant in the room are the Sadrists. This is a social movement that grew tremendously in the 1990s and in early 2000s that wasn't part of that opposition like the other groups, the Shia groups were, or even the Da'wah that was initially excluded against it, but then quickly joins in. So the Sadrists become excluded from this elite bargain, and then they create insurgency. And on the other side, those Sunnis who now feel like they don't have a political party, they're not prepared for this, they don't have representation. Also, some turn to violence, and we see that through insurgencies, Al-Qaeda, ISI, and other groups that emerge. So, and so the Americans, I think, obviously they do see this, and they see the problems in this. What's interesting is the Americans then start having to play by this. So Sunni awakening, these tribes of Anbar who aren't necessarily the most representative, but they then have to be like, okay, Iraq is a tribal country, let's support tribes, give them weapons, and have them kill the other Sunnis. So the Americans, whether they realize or don't realize, are often part of the problem. So in 2010, Nouri al-Maliki loses an election. The Americans are uncertain what to do, but at the end they back him, right? So Brett McGurk becomes a pivotal figure throughout these years on Iraq, and in various junctures, America supports the incumbent for the sake of short-term stability. But the problem becomes, in the longer term, these types of systems end up developing, being entrenched, and harming people every day.
And Shamiran, I want to turn it to you now. Understanding these dramatic transformations in the region and within Iraq that have just been described, what were some of the other post-war major events, whether that is, as we were just talking about a little bit, with the rise of ISIS, some of the Arab Spring, I would say Arab Spring uprisings, the rise of ISIS, and some of the sectarian violence and humanitarian crises. What kinds of processes of change did those trigger within Iraq?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you all this morning. And thank you, Ahmed, for facilitating all of this. I think just to piggyback on some of the things that were said within the context of, let's say, the past 12 years since the Arab uprisings, I think you definitely saw this kind of, what we call cascading effects, right? That these mass protests that started off in North Africa had this kind of diffusion effect that also had reverberations inside of Iraq in terms of small-scale protest movements that emerged at the time. And that wasn't necessarily something new. And I think this is one kind of interesting trend that we see that I think in some ways I see in a positive light after 2003 is that you've seen small-scale protest movements emerge since 2003. And of course, with that then comes how elites and the state have dealt with these protest movements. And in that sense, we've seen two kind of parallel trends, right? On the one hand, protest movements emerging, kind of this political space that opens up to a very small degree in comparison to, let's say, how it was under the Ba'ath regime. And you have these kind of intercommunal, cross-sectoral social movements that emerge that challenge the state capacity, call for a civic state, call for the dismantling of the system that Renat, I think, just really well captured in terms of, an ethno-sectarian, effectively power-sharing system that was put in place after 2003. And all of those kind of culminate in this mass protest movement that we see in 2019, which is the Tashrin protest movement. I think the largest in terms of scale and scope, both in terms of, people protesting and protest events. But I think just like the other cases of the Arab Spring, in this way, I think Iraq isn't unique where you see protest movements emerge, and then how states respond to these protest movements, I think is quite similar to what we saw, in places like Egypt and Syria and Yemen, et cetera, and these kind of more violent outcomes, in the sense that, Iraqi elites respond to the protest movements initially, with a pretty heavy hand. And I think that has all sorts of effects for how then groups kind of start to coalesce and consolidate across different sectors and across different localities in Baghdad, outside of Baghdad, especially protest movements in northern Iraq or in the Kurdistan region of Iraq as well. And so what's interesting is that, again, Iraq fits within this regional trend. And essentially, what's fascinating is that with all of these crises that Iraq has faced, these protest movements have kind of, emerged. There's an ebb and flow of how these protest movements kind of consolidated over the past 20 years. And I think one of the interesting things, again, that kind of really doesn't make Iraq anomalous is that you have this kind of brutal suppression of these protest movements across certain localities. And I think in the case of Iraq, that level of suppression and coercion comes obviously from, states kind of affiliated official kind of, coercive actors, right? The Iraqi military, security forces, etc. And then in the case, you also have protest movements being subverted by armed non-state actors. And I think in the case of Tishreen, we really saw the kind of full scale of that protesters between 2019, late 2018 into 2019. And I think, one of the kind of changes that we've seen is there's an interesting emergence in the messaging of the protest movements, through different humanitarian crises, the sectarian violence, and of course, after 2011, the wave of the kind of Arab Spring protest movements across the region, is that there is collective solidarities that have emerged across different localities. And that kind of speaks to very typical, trajectories of how social movements emerge. A lot of times these collective solidarities have cut across, class movements, sectarian movements, identity movements. And I think in some ways, though, I'm not an expert on the Iraqi Communist Party, but I think it's interesting that we've seen this happening at a time where we really haven't seen that emerge since at least the kind of peak of the Iraqi Communist Party days, where you have this mass movement that was able to cut across these fault lines. And so there's many kind of different dynamics that speak to regional trends, but also ones that are very uniquely Iraqi. And that's, I think, in some ways very typical of how developments in Iraq have played out.
I want to backtrack to the protests that were taking place in 2013, 2014 in Iraq. There's scenes that you can just remember from Hawija, right? There are people who feel disenfranchised, protesting against corruption, their lack of involvement, and they were cracked down upon violently. There's images of a man in a wheelchair who's been shot at by, I think it was a gunship helicopter, and he's just lying on the ground. And these videos just populate, like they spread across Iraq, and protests grew. And, eventually what would become ISIS did embed itself within some of those protests. And eventually that was a contributor to their rise, the rise of ISIS. Can you describe a little bit about the changes? If you were to take some of those 2013 protests and compare them with Tishreen or subsequent ones, what are some of the differences in demographics and issues between then and now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think they're a culmination, right? I see them as on a continuum. And I think a continuum kind of gives us a really good, kind of temporal view to see how they change over time and how they evolve over time. I think with the 2011 to 2012 and then into early 2013 protest movements that we see, especially in, let's say, the western part in the Anbar provinces, is that the collective grievances of the Sunni Arab community really came to this kind of, culminated in these protest movements that emerged. And I think much of that was because you had this cascading effect of the Arab uprisings, right? I think one of the key differences in there is that the protest movements in 2011 and 2012 were kind of concentrated in and around the Western Anbar province. They were quite local because they, spoke to very kind of Sunni Arab ingrained grievances, especially with, in governance and exclusion after 2003. There's a lot of grievances that were based, the question that Renaud brought up, on de-Baathification, that had a really, really kind of long enduring effect on Sunni disenfranchisement after 2003. All of these things were kind of served as the core of protester demands that fueled into grievances in that area. I think, and of course, as you mentioned, absolutely rightly so, there's this kind of very violent crackdown on those protesters, especially under, Nouri al-Maliki's rule. I think what you see in the Tishreen protest movement is and protest movement that emerges that has a kind of more national unifying vision, and one that is cross-sectoral, as in it cuts across different social classes, it cuts across different regions, it cuts across kind of district-based grievances as well. There were so many protest, posters that were, Sunni standing with their Shia brothers or their Kurdish brothers, etc. I mean, there were forms of collective solidarities, I think, that emerged in Tishreen that were quite different to a certain degree, right? If we kind of, again, see this as a continuum from the protest movements that emerged in 2013. But I think in both instances, right, if we were to kind of map one trend, and that is, the state's response to these collective protest movement was equally violent. And I think it kind of spoke, gave us a pretty good projection that, actors in Iraq, no matter where they come from and no matter where they govern, if there's a challenge that emerges from societal forces or from social forces to their rule, they're willing to respond indiscriminately, to quell those protest movements. And so that's been like a continuing thread, I think. And we see these, happening also in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, right? With the kind of suppression of reporters, of human rights activists, of protesters. And so that's a kind of troubling trend that we also see emerge on this kind of continuum of the nexus of, social movements, protest and mobilization, and then of course repression that comes with that.
Just briefly, if I may, why do you think that the Tishreen protests, some of these more recent protests have been more cross-cutting across classes, have been less sectarian, in fact, there's more solidarity in them? What was the cause of that?
I think it's a time horizon. Right. I think across time, the past 15 years, 17 years, Iraqis across the board, I think initially, let's say in 2003, when this kind of system was being put in place, there was this potential, thought that Sunni areas would be the most disenfranchised areas, and they would kind of be the most areas where you see the most laggard social and economic development. Right. But about, 17 years, 18 years down the line, that hasn't been the case. Right. Kurds in the north, minority populations, Assyrians, Yazidis, Turkmens, Shia majority Arabs in the south, Sunni Arabs to the west. In terms of actual district level data that we have, are pretty kind of, they lack behind in development, right? And so I think what Tishreen did is it tapped into these collective solidarities. And I think Iraqis came to realize that their grievances were actually not unique to their community, right? Nor were they unique to their localities. And so a clear example of that is if you compare development in places like in the south, in Nasiriyah and Basra, the most oil-rich areas. And if you want to kind of frame it strictly in ethno-sectarian terms, it kind of is a counterfactual, because there you should have seen the most robust economic and social development playing out because, the majority is in power. But that's not the case. Right? They're actually some of the most underdeveloped areas, not the most, they are the most underdeveloped areas, even though they have communal representation in parliament in Baghdad, right, the center of power, and they're the most resource rich. And so the narrative, I think, with Tishreen changes. And I think it changes again because Iraqis over this time horizon realized that actually no community is doing better. And so that kind of just fuels this kind of cross-sectoral solidarity movement that emerges.
Okay, so we're seeing these kinds of shifts happening internally within Iraq, but externally within the region, with various developments. So we're talking a little bit about this rise of Iran in the region as a result of this war, but the Iran-Saudi rivalry, which was gaining traction, and some of the efforts to try to address Iraq's positioning there. Dina, can you talk a little bit about what effect that has had in some of the attempts to negotiate, ends to particular conflicts that involve Saudi and Iran or other efforts in the region?
Sure, happy to. So I think Iraq has ended up being a watcher in everything that's happened. And it's watched these events unfold with very little control over them. And that's happened in the context of, as you aptly outlined, internal political turmoil, and then in the context of the competing interests of other countries regarding Iraq. And so these regional realignments are taking place in this context, and it kind of means that the regional realignments are playing out in Iraq as a result of both the context that Iraq is facing, but also just the fact that these countries have competing interests for the country. The one thing it has done for Iraq is it's also created an opportunity and for Iraq to basically mediate between some of these countries, including between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because it has good relations with everybody involved. And so Iraq kind of jumped on that bandwagon and decided it would be a good mediator. And it did a lot of the legwork before the Iran-Saudi deal. It just, in the view of, I think, Iran and Saudi Arabia, could not take the deal or the agreement past the finish line for a number of reasons. But basically, the Iran-Saudi rivalry played out in Iraq. Iraq was one arena in which it played out in, because both countries have interests in Iraq. Iran's interests are significant. And as a result, Iraq suffered. This competition for influence was a bizarre one. I kind of liken it to Saudi-Iranian competition for influence in a place like Lebanon. It was one where Saudi Arabia was never going to win. It could never win because Iran was so far ahead. It was so ingrained in Iraq that Riyadh never really had a chance. So Iraq it's not that they played the two against each other. I don't think they could do that, but they really tried to position themselves as the kind of mediator, middle ground, middle player between the two of them to bring them around a table, because the Iraqi elite realized that, it couldn't continue to be a playground for their rivalry and that it was suffering. If the rivalry, as a result of this Iran-Saudi deal that was signed in March, if the rivalry really does abate, because we have to remember that the deal is very limited in scope, and for now it's only about a reestablishment of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It doesn't address all the problem areas between the two countries. But if the rivalry between the two really does abate, then it might offer a little bit of breathing space for Iraqis. It might allow Saudi to be a little bit more involved. And actually, we've seen that over the course of the last few months, a little bit more involved economically through various investments that previously Iran was complicating in Iraq. I think Iran has also become more confident at the idea of Gulf money in some of the areas where it has influence over the last little while. And so I think that will help this potential Saudi investment into Iraq. So there is scope for things to improve a little bit, but all of that really depends on whether the Saudi-Iran deal is just about the reestablishment of ties, which is what it says on the tin, or whether it's about starting to resolve some of their differences in the region.
And what are some of the conditions that would be needed for this agreement to succeed? It's a two-parter, but for this agreement to succeed, but also just what is the desire within Iraq among leadership for Iraq to play this role?
You mean the mediation role that they were playing?
Yes.
Again, I think it was a very pragmatic, and I'm sure, Renat can also jump in on this. I think it was just a really pragmatic view of, we don't want to be caught in the middle anymore. It's bad for us. It makes us suffer. And we have these relationships on both sides, and we're interested in Saudi money. And so, here we are. There's a role for us to play. And they really did play it for a couple of years. And
continuing to play that role, like in the future?
I think it becomes more complicated now. I think now that we have the agreement, it becomes more difficult. I think the Baghdad process, or the other process that the Iraqis set up, a regional dialogue process, basically, that's supposed to be more inclusive, etc. I think that might continue. But even that, I don't think will continue in Iraq. I mean, we saw the second iteration of that conference happen in Amman. So even that becomes difficult because of the internal political turmoil in Iraq and because of the bandwidth issue that you have in Iraq right now. I think there is a desire to continue it. I just think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to do that. And I'd be interested in whether the other panelists agree with me or not on that. But in terms of the conditions needed for the Iran-Saudi deal to succeed, again, we have to remember that it's an agreement that's very limited in scope. So it depends how you define success. If you're looking at it in terms of we have to reestablish diplomatic ties, which is exactly what the deal said it would do, then we're doing pretty good. I mean, they missed the deadline of reestablishing ties within 2 months, but nobody bat an eyelid. Nothing happened. Everybody announced, appointed their ambassadors. I think the Iranian embassy has opened in Riyadh. And the Saudis have said that they are going to open their embassy within weeks. Again, like I said, nobody was bothered by this delay, even though in the past you could argue that anything like this would have been enough to derail the implementation of the deal, given the tensions between the two countries. So it's looking good. We saw the Saudis help out the Iranians in terms of evacuations in Sudan. There's a lot of talk of back and forths and visits, and the Saudi foreign minister was just in Iran. I mean, all of this is good news. But if you're defining success as, not just reestablishing ties, but a resolution of their differences, significant, concrete de-escalation of tensions between the two, then it's a little bit early to assess that, because even though you have this goodwill, this motivation, this good mood right now, and real drivers towards de-escalating between the two that exist, it remains to be seen whether that will work. I mean, there are so many things that could derail the implementation of this deal. Cite one, the Houthi Saudi potential deal in Yemen is something that if it happens, then I think that will be good for the Iran-Saudi deal. If it doesn't happen, that'll be a real thorn in the backside of the deal and might affect the implementation of the agreement. So it really remains to be seen whether the success of the deal can lead to something more for the region, or whether it's just going to be a reestablishment of ties and dialogue.
Fascinating. And Renad, to have you jump in to kind of weigh in on the same question, but also just how are Iraqis viewing this deal? What is their perception, or what are some of the attitudes or prevailing notions about it?
Sure. I think obviously Iraqis see themselves, they want their country to be a powerful regional country. They don't want to be a playground. Because having to live in a country where the US assassinates senior Iranian generals, or Iranian groups, fire against others, this has massive consequences that we're still living through around the country, right? And so to some extent, a peaceful neighborhood could begin. But of course, Iraqis have huge problems in any case, notwithstanding what's happening in the region. But I agree, and I think it's interesting if you look at Iran has a big problem in Iraq right now, which is, and on Shamiran's point on Tishreen, it's the Shia population of Iraq that's rejecting Iran's ideological path, right? So for 5 to 10 years, Shia Iraqis who were assumed to be the same as Iran, they're going to be together, they're going to create this, this bond, that's broken. Iraqis are saying we want Iran out. So Iran has a massive longer-term problem, and that's linked to this political system that Iran has helped to construct, where not one person becomes powerful and all of these different elites are able to, Iran can manage. That system is often on the brink, right? Like we saw in 2014, and then you have ISIS and Iran is stuck. So Iran has a very difficult task in Iraq, which is to create a country that's not too strong, because we don't want the return of a powerful Arab strongman, but not too weak either. And that's the issue. And Saudi Arabia sees this, right? So since 2015-16, as the Shia of Iraq are saying we want Iran out, Saudi starts reaching out to Shia leaders, right? Muqtada Sadr goes to Riyadh. Qasim al-Araji, who is from the Badr organization, an armed group created by Iran to promote the revolution in the 80s, it goes to Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia begins to realize that Iraq isn't necessarily a lost case to Iran in that sense. But of course, Saudi Arabia has a long way to go, as Dina said, to get to how strong Saudi Arabia has a long way to go to get to where Iran is across the Iraqi state and society. And on the international element too, I think Iraqi leaders like the idea of having international relations. Let NATO come and have a massive mission and let all they have to do is just have coffee with our guys and spend hundreds of billions, and that's enough. Let the EU spend money. Let all of these development funds spend. Over the last 20 years, they spent hundreds of billions, not really reforming or doing much, but it gives this kind of sense that Iraq is not a pariah state. And I think this is important because Iraq's wealth, but also Iraq's access to both financial and diplomatic worlds gives all Iraqi elites, including those who are against the West, an interest in keeping Iraq open. And so although sometimes we hear in the rhetoric anti-Americanism or anti-Saudi, in general, there is a realization that Iraq serves a pivotal function for the elite across the spectrum.
And internally within Iraq, can you describe some of the political challenges right now, and especially the political impasse at the moment? What are some of the reasons for that, and what is the likelihood of being able to address some of those challenges and improve that kind of governance and politics?
Sure. And it'd be good to hear from the work that I've been focusing on looks at corruption as a fundamental driver of everyday violence and conflict for Iraqis. And here I'm not talking about corruption, petty corruption, paying bribes, but I'm talking about the political system in which the elite have this power sharing agreement where they've determined what the rules of the game are and divert revenue to gain economic power, but then that has an expense, a human toll. And you can do this across sectors, but one study we did was looking at the pharmaceutical sector. So the Ministry of Health has $1 billion a year to make sure that there's medicine coming in. But of course, because of corruption, what the reality is that 70 to 80% of medicine is either fake or expired. So Iraqis are not taking the medicine they need. And the ripple effect of that is Iraqis therefore no longer trust the healthcare system. So even if they're sick in other areas, right? So this type of violence, this is structural violence that you can't see every day, right? So if you go to Baghdad now, you see development, you see all these buildings, being built, and everyone's excited because if you read the Iraqi body, if you look at the kind of ups and downs of civilian casualties, it's only looking at one type of violence, which is, are civilians being targeted by armed groups? It's very difficult to look at Iraq, which has one of the lowest life expectancies, especially for its income. When you look at these or look at the HDI and these sort of indexes, people are struggling every day. Corruption education means Iraqis aren't being made ready to compete. Corruption in electricity means they don't have, in summers, it becomes very hot. They can't, survive at times. And we can go on and on. Iraq is vulnerable to climate change because corruption has, so these are all the conflicts that Iraqis feel every day. But from the outside, it's very difficult to really get that sense unless you are speaking to them and feeling their grievances with the system of corruption that was pretty much enforced on them in 2003, and which they are rejecting. And the challenge for the elite, and this goes to Shamiran's time scale, is there was a time when this new elite had ideological power. They could say, we're representing your sect, or they could say, we're anti-corruption, but no one believes them anymore. There was a time when the elite could buy people in a way by offering public sector jobs. But, and we've seen the public sector employment go from 500,000 to millions. People just, because of the rentier nature of the state, everyone gets a job in the public sector. This is not sustainable. And that's why we're seeing more repression, because it's the only way to try and control. If you can't economically or ideologically control, you need the judiciary and you need the police to do that job.
Yeah, no, those are very powerful points. And I really appreciated the pharmaceutical report. And I just want to do a call out also on this healthcare issue and how deeply intimate, it's such an important way of understanding corruption and its effects, and as you say, like violence on the lives of ordinary people. There was an extraordinary Washington Post series, I think in 2021, that looked at healthcare in this lens and corruption and how it very intimately affected the lives of ordinary Iraqis. And so if you have not read that, I would highly encourage you to explore it, because like Renad was saying, it's a incredible example of a major driver of political attitudes and political impasses there in Iraq. And it speaks to Shamiran, your point earlier about Basra and some of these regions that are incredibly wealthy, and yet those living there don't see the effects of that. I want to turn to you, Shamiran. And by the way, we will have like a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please feel free to pop it into the chat. But Shamiran, Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq have come together to form an alliance in recent years based on some shared interests with security, political, and economic interests. They've been talking about more joint cooperation and, you know, their energy links, but how do you envision that kind of an alliance proceeding, and what strengths does it have?
Yeah, I think this is it's a good question. And I think, you know, we've seen, again, I think in time horizons, and I think that this isn't really something new. You know, there was an agreement in the late 1980s. It lasted up until Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, known as the Arab Cooperation Council. And it was an agreement precisely between Jordan and Egypt. And that agreement was on economic terms. It was there to basically facilitate trade. Iraq was starting to look outwards towards its neighbors. You know, we've seen these kinds of alliances, I mean, in so many ways, like Kuwait, and not Kuwait necessarily, but places like Jordan and others were the bedrock of the Iraqi economy during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And so I see them, and you have this like rupture that happens where, you know, after the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, regional states just kind of back off. But I think this kind of speaks to a historic trend. I don't see it as something necessarily new. I see it as potentially a new kind of diplomatic channel by which Iraq is looking to kind of outsource its oil wealth, its gas wealth, its resources. I think both countries sit at this really interesting geographic political nexus where, you know, they kind of make them easy states to have these trade ties and trade relations with. And I, you know, as of like 2017, Egypt definitely started importing Iraqi oil. You know, Jordan's looking to do the same, if not more robustly. And so I don't necessarily see them as something new. I think they're definitely a continuation of patterns we've seen in the past. And I think that, you know, one of the things I'm kind of paying attention to is the Arab Cooperation Council was short-lived, and it was short-lived because of these, you know, the earlier conversation about these kind of Iraq's domestic development tied to regional development. And so the question then becomes, I think with all of the regional alignments that we're seeing now, it's no surprise that Jordan and Egypt want to kind of have, you know, closer ties with Iraq as well. And it's kind of about time that they establish these closer trade partnerships and diplomatic ties. And so the question then becomes, are they going to be sustainable? Is this going to be something that's going to kind of continue in the long run? And this goes to Dina's point, right? Like, it's one thing to say we're going to have these diplomatic relations. It's another to actualize them, right? To bring them to fruition in, you know, a 3-year or 5-year kind of time stamped goal of where these kind of strategic partnerships go. And I see this as a strategic partnership. It's one that's based on bolstering trade. It's one that's based on kind of for Iraq to have, you know, diversified regional ways to export its oil and kind of in easier ways. And so it's, I think, you know, I see it as being sustainable. I think I see that being more sustainable than potentially even the Iran-Saudi deal, because it's one that speaks directly to economic trade and partnerships. Yeah.
Thank you. We have some questions from the chat, so I'm going to jump into one of them. Someone is asking whether there's the possibility of a Hezbollah-inspired group emerging in Iraq due to growing Iranian influence. Renad, Dina, Shamiran, who would like to take this particular question? All right, I'm just going to make a decision, and Dina, please.
I was just unmuting myself. I'm happy to start. It depends what you call a Hezbollah-like group. I mean, Iran already has a pretty hefty constituency in Iraq. And the Hashd is already closely affiliated with Iran. I mean, they obviously work very closely together. They get a lot of advice from Tehran, to put it mildly. So is there a need for yet another Hezbollah-like organization there? I don't know. I think the more pressing issue now is if and whether there is a desire to integrate elements of the Hashd into government and kind of get moving on that, rather than see the emergence of more non-state actor or Iran-leaning non-state actors. Also, Iranian influence in the country is something that, I mean, it's there. You cannot deny it. It's not going to go anywhere. But it's not something that's uncontroversial. We saw in 2019 and since 2019 a lot of pushback from Iraqis against Iranian influence in the country, something which at times has caused concern in Tehran as well. So again, I'm not sure the proliferation of more Iranian affiliated groups is in Iran's interest. If it happens naturally because there are new constituencies that emerge in Iraq, then, you know, fine. But I don't think it's something that Iran wants, that's for sure.
And this was briefly touched upon, I think by you, Renad, but the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and that being a compelling point for many Iraqis about the ability for Iraq to be used by other governments for this particular rivalry. What are some of the, in this current moment, what are some of these sorts of trigger points that you see when it comes to either Iranian involvement or other external involvement that are really bringing people, whether that's to the streets or whether that is, informing these attitudes about what we don't want to be involved with anymore?
Yeah, sure. And maybe I can also add to what Dina said, which I agree with. Hezbollah is obviously a very centralized institution in Lebanon around the leader in a way that the Hashd is not. The Hashd is many different groups, as was said, but also something that, and this links to the assassination question, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was also, killed with Qasem Soleimani, was trying at the time to centralize the Hashd a bit more, because it's you have all these different networks, and not only Shia, by the way, Christian and other, Sunnis and all of the different minoritized groups. How do you bring them together? How do you manage all of this? To some extent is an issue. So I think there's that question, which is it like Hezbollah? But I think there's another interesting question, which is the post-2003 Iraqi state. Those who came in, many of them had their own version of an armed group, whether that is the Peshmerga, the two big Kurdish parties, or Badr or others. And they were never going to give them up, right? And I think that's been clear now, that impunity becomes the name of the game for post-2003 Iraqi politics. And a way to ensure impunity from the new state was to have that as your defense, to always rely on direct access to arms. So that model is certainly there. And so this, to me, is the biggest challenge for Iraqis. Some people focus on democracy. Some people say that Iraq has elections and changes of prime ministers. And therefore, it's on a kind of, there's a process in place. But Iraq is struggling with the rule of law, right? There is impunity across the board. So to me, most Iraqis, that's what they want to focus on, right? It's not that they've given up on democracy. It's not that they, it's not that, they don't like the idea of democracy, or even that necessarily, although they do say this, that they want a strong man to return, right? Because they want more predictability in their daily lives. The biggest challenge is there's no accountability. right? Many protesters and researchers have been assassinated with very little accountability. There was $2.5 billion stolen from the country's tax reserves, and some of the culprits are back to doing business already, right? There's no rule of law. So what are we talking about when we're talking about this long democratization process? I think we need to focus on this type of impunity that is how the state is constructed partly through these armed groups.
And Shamiran, I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in last as a sort of closing to some of this, if you'd like.
Yeah, I think, everything that Renaud just mentioned and Dina had reflected on earlier, I think one of the biggest challenges now for, Iraq's kind of democratic project over the past 2 decades is what will elites make of it? I mean, so much of how we understand democracy, its trajectory, its emergence, consolidation, etc., it's an elite game, right? Whether or not elites will moderate, whether or not elites will reform. And I think this is something that Prime Minister Shia al-Sudani has, faces a challenge that his predecessors also faced. The question then becomes, is he going to be that prime minister who could potentially take Iraq on this kind of moderating reformist approach and deal with some of these crises that Renaud so rightly and succinctly kind of covered. And I think that, again, all depends on this kind of the political will, right, of these ruling elites to kind of decide on the trajectory of the state and the fate of the state. But I think as it stands now, I think it's too early to tell for this year. But what we've seen is consistent decline in Iraqis' trust in the political process, right? Consistent decline in rule of law, consistent decline in freedom of expression, freedom of association, all of these other things that are core foundations of how we understand what a democracy is, right? Democracy isn't just a numbers game, isn't just about holding elections. I think Iraq has done well on that front. It's held regular and consistent elections. Turnout has been decent up until the last one. And I think in terms of, that kind of mechanism is there, but there's a whole other side to democracy, which is all of these factors and kind of conditions that come with what makes it consolidate, what makes it attractive to its citizens. And right now, we just haven't seen that actually come to fruition, right? And so, and it speaks to all of these things, that it fuels the absence of rule of law, the absence of protection for freedom of expression, freedom of liberties, individual freedom, et cetera, protection for minorities. All of these things fuel state erosion, right? And they fuel corruption. And so it becomes this kind of cycle that political elites not only are not willing to kind of reform, but they actually propagate across time. And so, I'm kind of holding out to see if there's potential breakaway. Sometimes historically, that's all that's needed, right? If we look at other democratic waves, it's one leader or one political party that makes a decision to, this isn't working, we're going to try something else. So it's not, I don't want to think about Iraq as a lost cause. I think there's hope, but again, democracy is an elite game, right? It's all about what politicians make of it. And so that time horizon, I'm still kind of looking at, to see what the outcome will be in that sense.
Wonderful. Well, thank you each so much. Each of you, I've learned so much in our short time speaking with one another. I find your work fascinating, and I'll definitely keep reading, as I hope all of you who attended here continue to read their incredible work. And thank you so much for coming. Oh, Ahmed, I think you're muted.
I just wanted to thank you all for the engaging discussion and for providing us with such valuable insights into the current state of affairs in Iraq. We find your contributions, it's given us a lot to think about, and we sincerely appreciate your input and the time you've given us today. Thank you.